I intend to finish the series on the call to the ministry this morning. I've got quite a bit here, but I think I can wrap it up in this one Sunday. Just by way of review, and I'm going to say this now, and I'm going to say it again at the end also. I'm not preaching this to scare anybody. If someone feels the call for this, I just want you to have your eyes open. I want you to know what you're walking into, or at least have an idea. You'll never know exactly what you're walking into until you get there, but at least have kind of an idea of what this is. So we started this a couple of weeks ago, and the first thing that we looked at were the 5 names or the titles of the pastoral office. And these names represent what they describe. So we had elder, bishop, overseer, steward, minister, and pastor. Scripture knows nothing of a bunch of different offices in a New Testament church. That's not scriptural. There is no such thing as a youth pastor or a worship pastor or a music pastor or an old folks pastor or an LBGQT pastor or a young married person's pastor or a young divorced couple's pastor. That's not scriptural. There's only one. There's one office of a pastor, and all of these titles represent different aspects of what that one man does. Now, there might be multiple elders within one church, but there's always one that heads up the church and is the pastor. Therefore, while Pastor Gerald was still alive, he lived in Detroit there towards the end of his life. Well, he was still an elder. So there were 2 elders at the Detroit church at that time, but Pastor Mott was the pastor. At the church of Ephesus, there were a bunch of different elders there, but Timothy was the pastor. So there's not all these different roles, and there's no hierarchy in the New Testament church. It's not that the elders above the bishop is above the pastor is above no, that's nowhere to be found in the New Testament. Okay? That's a man-made idea. There are 2 offices in a New Testament church, pastor and deacon. That's it. Nothing else. Now, we also consider the weightiness of this calling, the fact that the ministry is unlike any other profession on earth. And until a man is served as a New Testament minister, he has no idea what this job is. None. I trained under Pastor Gerald for 25 years. When I must have preached, I know I preached hundreds of times, maybe 1,000, I don't know. But over that 25 years, I had a very special position. I knew more about what was going on in the Las Vegas church than anybody else did. He kept me informed because I would have to go up there on my own and he wouldn't be there. And if there was something going on, I needed to know what it was. Because that was a weird church, folks, and we've got people smiling that remember those days. So for 25 years, I did this. At my ordination, Pastor Mott said something to me that kind of shocked me a little bit. He said, "Jim, you have no idea what you're stepping into, but you're going to find out." And he was absolutely correct. If I, after 25 years of training under that man, did not have a clue what this job is until I got into it, how can anybody know what this job is if they've never done it? It always makes me giggle a little bit on the inside when people come along and try to tell me how I should do this better, do that. You don't even know what I do. You don't even know my job. But it's something that you will only find out when you've done it. We also show that it's the province and the duty of an ordained elder to recognize one whom God has enabled for the ministry, and it's his duty to train him. and then, when he's ready, ordain him. Last week we looked at the requirements for the office of an elder and saw that there were a lot of them, the big long list in 2 passages. And we also looked at the work of the ministry, the job description, if you will, which is primarily teaching, evangelizing, edifying, which means building up, admonishing, exhorting, reproving, rebuking, and being an example. That's the actual job description, which is contrary to a lot of what you're going to find out there in the world. Okay? Now that brings us up to date. So the first point that I want to make this morning is that, and thank God for this, God's not limited to the most intelligent or the most eloquent or the most physically strongest or the most attractive men for the office of an elder. It's not limited to that. He chooses who he wants. And a lot of times he chooses failed people because it tends to show more glory to him than it does to the man that's standing in the office. The first place I want you to look is Exodus chapter 4, and we're going to read verses 10 through 17. We're going to talk about Moses. Interesting thing about, Moses, we get this picture of Charlton Heston, if you've ever watched the 10 Commandments. That probably really wasn't what Moses was like. Exodus chapter 4, beginning at verse 10. And Moses said unto the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither heretofore nor since thou hast spoken unto thy servant, but I am slow of speech and of a slow tongue. And the Lord said unto him, Who hath made man's mouth, or who maketh the dumb or deaf, or the seeing or the blind? Have not I the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with thy mouth, and teach thee what thou shalt say. And he said, O my Lord, send, I pray thee, by the hand of him whom thou wilt send. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. And he said, Is not Aaron the Levite thy brother? I know he can speak well, and also, behold, he cometh forth to meet thee. And when he seeth thee, he will be glad in his heart, and thou shalt speak unto him and put words in his mouth, and I will be with thy mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you what you shall do. And he shall be thy spokesman unto the people, and he shall be, even he shall be to thee instead of a mouth, and thou shalt be to him instead of God, and thou shalt take this rod in thine hand, wherewith thou shalt do signs. Moses stuttered. There used to be a country singer called Mel Tillis. I don't know if any of you remember old Mel Tillis. He was perfectly fine when he was singing, but boy, to try to listen to that guy talk, just jabber on it. There was a movie, have any of you ever seen the movie My Cousin Vinny, where the public defender shows up and starts questioning these witnesses, and he can't get he stutters. And it just drives you nuts. You want to help finish the sentence for the poor guy. That was Moses. And God sends Moses before Pharaoh. See, he doesn't have to just pick the most eloquent. Look at Judges chapter 6. And this is at a time when Israel did what Israel always did. They would drift into idolatry and God would punish them. And this is one of those times when they were under punishment as a result of not following the Lord. And in Judges chapter 6, beginning at verse 11, it says, And there came an angel of the Lord and sat under an oak which was in Ophrah, that pertained unto Joash the Abiezrite, and his son Gideon threshed wheat by the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. The Midianites had pretty much taken over, And they were just coming in and plundering the place, taking whatever they could get. So Gideon's trying to hide some food because there's nothing left. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him and said unto him, The Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valor. And Gideon said unto him, O my Lord, if the Lord be with us, why then is all this befallen us? And where be all his miracles which our fathers told us of, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites. And the Lord looked upon him and said, Go in this thy might, and thou shalt save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have not I sent thee? And when he said unto him, O my Lord, wherewith shall I save Israel? Behold, my family is poor in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. And the Lord said unto him, Surely I will be with thee, and thou shalt smite the Midianites as one man. And he said unto him, If now I have found grace in thy sight, then show me a sign that thou talkest with me. Again, he didn't go to the biggest brother. He didn't go to the man. No, he went to the little kid and sent him. He's not limited by who it is that he calls to this office. So don't think that you have to be able to win a beauty contest. I certainly couldn't. If God calls a man, he calls a man, regardless of all the rest of the stuff. And he will give the man what the man needs in order to do the job. That's part of this. That's the part that everyone needs to know. Look at Acts chapter 4 and verse 13. Now here's when some of the Jews see Peter and John, and it says, Now when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were unlearned and ignorant men, they marveled, and they took knowledge of them that had been with Jesus. These were just like country bumpkin guys. You wouldn't expect much out of them, and yet they knew more than these doctors of the law. And finally, look at 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 26. I forget who it was that referred to this verse. I keep thinking it was one of the queens of England, but I think that's wrong. But I know it was somebody who said, thank God for the M. Thank God for the M in this verse. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, beginning at verse 26. For you see your calling, brethren, how that not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called. I'm glad it says many instead of not any. He did call a few. But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. And God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. And base things of the world, and things which are despised hath God chosen, yea, and the things which are not, to bring to naught the things that are. Why would you do that? That no flesh should glory in his presence. So God doesn't usually, you think about King Saul. King Saul was the type that the Israelites wanted as a king. And he was a horrible king. God chose David, not Saul. Okay? And another point is that when God distributes his gifts, he does it in measures. He distributes gifts in measures. In Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 7, it says, But unto every one of us is given grace according to the measure of the gift of Christ. Okay? In Romans chapter 12 and verse 3, Paul says, "For I say through the grace given unto me to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly according as God hath dealt to every man the measure of faith." Now, this word measure comes from the Greek word metron, which means a limited portion. He doesn't give you everything. He gives you what you need to do the job where he's called you to do the job. And that said, many times he only gives it to the minister as the minister needs it. It's on it. I can't tell you the number of times over the last 12 and a half years that I've struggled with things on trying to figure out how I'm going to deal with something, and I just keep asking for the answer, and I don't get it, and I don't get it, and I don't get it, and then all of a sudden, the day that I have to have it, I wake up, and there it is. He's never failed me. He always give it to me, but he'll always give it to me like, you don't need it yet. When you need it, you'll get it. But you don't need it yet. And that's kind of how this works. And that keeps you dependent on him. Part of how he works. Another thing is he doesn't give the same number or types of gifts or talents to everybody. We don't all get the same batch. We get what we need to do the job where we're called to do the job. Okay? If you look at the parable of the talents over in Matthew chapter 25, beginning at verse 14, it says, "For the kingdom of heaven is as a man traveling into a far country, who called his own servants and delivered unto them his goods. And unto one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to every man according to his several ability, and straightway took his journey." So he gives the man what the man needs for the specific job that he's called him to do. There are things that I don't need because the members of this church are not in that situation. If it ends up in a situation where, well, then maybe that's something I'll have to get later. But you get what you have to have. If you're called to this work, God will give you what you need to do the job. So even though you struggle, he's there and he'll give it to you. Now over in Acts chapter 20 and verse 28, we read this: "Take heed therefore unto yourselves and to all the flock over the which the Holy Ghost hath made you overseers, to feed the church of God which he hath purchased with his own blood." It's the Lord that sets a qualified man over a church. This is not a job where you just put a resume out and a board of directors goes and listens to you and decides. No, God calls the man to the specific work. He puts the man there. And I want you to notice this word overseers here in this verse. That's the word episkopos. We discussed that on the first lesson. That's the word for bishop. That's an overseer. And where it says to feed, that's the word for pastor or shepherd. Okay? So, and Paul said over in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 12, "I thank Christ Jesus our Lord, who hath enabled me, for that he counted me faithful, putting me into the ministry." So God's the one that puts you in the ministry, yet the church must receive the man as their overseer for him to be of any benefit to them. If they don't receive him, they're not going to get much out of his preaching. And this is a sad thing. It happens a lot. I used to see this happen when I was a little kid. in the missionary Baptists, they'd only leave you in a church for a few years, and then they'd move you off to some other church, and some new guy would come in. And you would hear a bunch of the old blue-haired ladies complaining about how much they liked the old guy better than they liked the new guy, and we just don't get much out of his teaching. Well, that's because you never accepted him as your pastor. And it's unfortunate, but many times a guy gets old and dies or retires, and a young guy has to come in and take his place. And if that church doesn't accept him, and they just want to keep hanging on to the old guy and not let go of the old guy, they'll never get anything out of his teaching. They just won't get anything from him. That's unfortunate. Jesus said in John 13:20, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that receiveth whomsoever I send receiveth me, and he that receiveth me receiveth him that sent me." It's the church's obligation to receive the man that God sends. And if they don't do it, they're just not going to get much out of him. He could be the best pastor that ever walked, but if they just keep hanging on to the old guy, it's a waste of time. This is a primary reason that I believe Pastor Mott did a very good thing in Las Vegas back in 1987 when he turned that church over to Conrad Jarrell. He came out for one last time and he said, "Don't call me anymore. Don't call me. Don't write me letters. Don't listen to my sermons. You have a pastor, and his name is Conrad Jarrell. It's not Ben Mott." And he cut us off. That was it. And it was probably the best thing he could have ever done, because people would have continued to call Ben Mott. What do I do about this? What do I do about that? Well, you should call your pastor and ask him. I think it was a stroke of genius that he did that. I really do. And I think this is one of the primary reasons that when Moses died, remember the story about that? Moses passes away, never gets to go into the promised land. And you remember it was Moses that parted the Red Sea, and the people walked across the Red Sea on dry land, right? Do you know what God did now that Moses is dead and Joshua is taking over? You know what God did? He parted the Jordan River the exact same way that he parted the Red Sea, and the people walked across the Jordan River on dry land just like they'd done with Moses, so that they realized Joshua's God's man now. We follow Joshua. So the church needs to now, and let me show you this. Look at 1 Samuel chapter 16. Verses 11 through 13, and we're going to talk about David. 1 Samuel 16, beginning at verse 11. And Samuel said unto Jesse, now Samuel shows up at Jesse's house and wants to see all of the kids because one of them is going to be the king. So Jesse brings all of his sons out and he goes through and looks at all of them, okay? And in verse 11 it says, and Samuel said unto Jesse, are here all thy children? And he said, there remaineth yet the youngest, and behold, he keepeth the sheep. And Samuel said unto Jesse, send and fetch him, for we will not sit down till he come hither. And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and with all of a beautiful countenance and goodly to look on. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is he. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brethren. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. So God calls David and has the prophet anoint him, right? But now I want you to see the other side of this. Look at 2 Samuel chapter 2, beginning at verse 1 through 4. And it came to pass after this, that David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah? And the Lord said unto him, go up. And David said, whither shall I go up? And he said, unto Hebron. So David went up thither, and his 2 wives also. I'm not going to destroy their names. And his men that were with him did David bring up, every man with his household, and they dwelt in the cities of Hebron. And the men of Judah came, and there anointed David king over the house of Judah. God had already called him and anointed him, but here Judah is accepting the call that God had made, and they anoint him as king. Now look also at 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 1 through 3. Then came all the tribes of Israel to David unto Hebron, and spake, saying, behold, we are thy bone and thy flesh. Also in time past, when Saul was king over us, thou wast he that led us out and brought us in Israel. And the Lord said to thee, thou shalt feed my people Israel, and thou shalt be captain over Israel. So all the elders of Israel came to the king to Hebron, and King David made a league with them in Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed him king over Israel. See, there's the pattern. There's the pattern. God calls the man, and then the people accept the man. And that is the pattern. And if you look at Matthew chapter 10, I actually witnessed this one time, and it was a sad day. Because you see, if the people don't accept the man that's sent, that man has the right to walk away from him. That if a congregation refuses to receive the man God sent, that man's justified in just refusing to oversee that group of people. In Matthew chapter 10, verses 14 and 15, after he had sent these preachers out, he said in verse 14, and whosoever shall not receive you nor hear your words, when you depart out of that house or city, shake off the dust off your feet. Verily I say unto you, it shall be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city. And Wendy and I witnessed that one time when Pastor Gerald walked out of the Las Vegas church and shook the dust off of his jackets, and out the door they went. Look also at Acts chapter 18. And this is a case where after preaching, the people decide they don't want to hear what Paul had to say. Acts chapter 18. And verse 6. Well, look at verse 5. And when Silas and Timotheus were come from Macedonia, Paul was pressed in the spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus was Christ. And when they opposed themselves and blasphemed, he shook his raiment and said unto them, your blood be upon your own heads, I'm clean from henceforth. I will go into the Gentiles. So if they don't accept the man God sends, the man is justified in walking out the door. Now the next point is a man must be proved for the office of a bishop. Last week, when we looked at the qualifications, we saw over in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 10, and I made this point last week, I'll make it quickly this morning, that the qualifications for a deacon are also qualifications for a bishop. And we showed that with the grammar. And in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 10, now that we've moved down to the deacons, it says, and let these also first be proved. Deacons need to be proved. Ministers, pastors need to be proved. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 8. And verse 22. And we have sent with them our brother, whom we have oftentimes proved diligent in many things, but now much more diligent upon the great confidence which I have in you. You see, the man's got to be proved. To prove something means to put a person or a thing to the test, to test or assess the genuineness or the qualities. In 1 Thessalonians 5:21, we're given that instruction to prove all things and hold fast that which is good. If you hear something, make sure that it's, before you pass it on, make sure that you've proven it's correct. Make sure that it's right, especially with social media these days. I think the only thing that you can believe on Facebook anymore are pictures of puppies. The rest of it is just nonsense. And it's one lie after another, after another, after another, and most of it cannot be proved. So don't just keep shoving it down the road. If you can't prove it, end it. And let it go. Prove things. Now, in Philippians chapter 3, and I know I say this a lot, and I know that there are people that don't like to listen. They just can't fathom the idea that someone that claims to be a Christian isn't a Christian. They just really have a hard time with that. Even though I've said it for years, Pastor Gerald said it for years, Pastor Mott has said it for years, Pastor Wagner has said it, we've all said it over and over and over again, and it just seems to go over the top of some folks' heads. So let's let the Apostle Paul say it and see if you'll hear it from him. In Philippians chapter 3 and verse 17, we read, "Brethren, be followers together of me, and mark them which walk, so as ye have us for an example. Your minister better teach the same doctrine that the Apostle Paul taught. He better walk the same way the Apostle Paul walked. He better live the way the Apostle Paul did." That's what Paul is saying here. Okay? But he continues, because he says, for many. That word many comes from a Greek word which means mostly, largely, abundantly, the majority. Now he's talking about people that are claiming to be Christian ministers, and the majority fall into this other category. They walk, of whom I have told you often, and now tell you even weeping, that they are the enemies of the cross of Christ. They're not just a little bit mistaken, folks, they're enemies. They want to destroy Christ. They're working for the other side, and that's the majority of them. So when someone comes along and says, well, I'm a Christian, check their doctrine. What do they really believe? Don't just follow them. And he goes on to say, whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, and whose glory is in their shame, who mind earthly things. So when it comes to a minister, he better line up with the Apostle Paul. If he doesn't, then it's time for you to shake off your raiment and walk out the door. He better line up with Paul. Now, and notice we're talking about a minister being proved. Well, how do you prove him? Well, you listen to him and you line him up. Does what he say match the Bible? If it doesn't, then run, Forrest, run as fast as you can. Now, I want you to consider how Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were proved. Look at Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1, and we're going to begin at verse 12. Nebuchadnezzar had decided that he wanted these promising young men that had come from Israel, he was going to feed them at the king's table, give them all the best of everything. But that food had been offered to idols. And so they didn't want to eat it. So they said this in verse 11, then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Okay? Beans and water. Just give us refried beans and water. That's all we want. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat. And as thou seest, deal with thy servants. So he consented to them in this matter and proved them 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all of the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. You say, well, what does that mean? Results. Look at the results. Prove the man by the results. If God uses a man to do the work of a minister that is called to a specific work, then you judge him by the results. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And verse 2, where Paul says, if I be not an apostle unto others, yet doubtless I am to you, for the seal of mine apostleship are ye in the Lord. The results of his being an apostle were the churches that he started and the people that had learned from him. That was the proof of the Apostle Paul. Look also at 2 Corinthians chapter 3. Beginning at verse 1. Do we begin again to commend ourselves, or need we, as some others, epistles of condemnation to you, or letters of condemnation or of commendation from you? Ye are our epistle written in our hearts, known and read of all men, for as much as ye are manifestly declared to be the epistle of Christ, ministered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not in tables of stone, but in fleshy tables of the heart. The proof of the Apostle Paul were the people that he ministered to. The fact that they were there. And like I said, if God uses a man to do the work of a minister, that's the proof he's called to preach. Look at Acts chapter 13. Acts 13, beginning at verse 1. Now there were in the church that was at Antioch certain prophets and teachers, as Barnabas and Simon that was called Niger, and Lucius of Cyrene, and Manaen, which had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch and Saul. As they ministered to the Lord and fasted, the Holy Ghost said, "Separate me Barnabas and Saul for the work whereunto I have called them." And when they had fasted and prayed and laid their hands on them, they sent them away. That was the ordination of Barnabas and Saul. And then they sent them. Now, where'd they go? Look at Acts chapter 14, beginning at verse 26. And then sailed to Antioch, from whence they had been recommended to the grace of God for the work which they fulfilled. And when they were come and had gathered the church together, they rehearsed all that God had done with them, and how he had opened the door of faith unto the Gentiles. They were sent, and they were successful. They had success. The results of their being sent proved that they were sent. Had they not been sent, then there wouldn't have been anything. I would think anyway, or I'd hope to think that over the past 12 and a half years or so since Wendy and I moved down here, that some of you have grown spiritually, some. Maybe your faith's a little stronger. Maybe your patience can hold out a little longer than it did before. Maybe you have a little bit more understanding and knowledge. Maybe your walk is better than it was 12 and a half years ago when I came here. If it is, that's the proof I was sent. That's the evidence. Look for the fruit. If you have fruit in your life as a result of a minister preaching to you, then that's the evidence that the man was sent to minister to you. And that's how you prove him. It's the results in the lives of the people that the minister's sent to that proves his call. And if God calls the man and the man's doing the job, there ought to be fruit. And people ought to be growing. And this is all, I hate to say it, this is on God's timetable. It's not on yours. I'm going to refer back to my buddy here, Spurgeon, again. And I felt this way in my earlier days as well. I was long distressed, as you are, about what was or was not a proper call to the ministry. It now seems to me an easy point to solve, but perhaps it will not be so to you till the Lord shall make it clear to yourself in your own case. I have not room to say so much as I could. In brief, I think it principally includes three things. One, a warm and earnest desire to be employed in this service. I apprehend the man who is once moved by the Spirit of God to this work will prefer it, if attainable, to thousands of gold and silver, so that though he is at times intimidated by a sense of its importance and difficulty, compared with his own great insufficiency, for it is to be presumed a call of this sort, if indeed from God, will be accompanied with humility and self-abasement, yet he cannot give it up. I hold it a good rule to inquire in this point whether the desire to preach is more fervent in our most lively and spiritual frames and when we are most laid in the dust before the Lord. If so, it's a good sign. But if, as is sometimes the case, a person is very earnest to be a preacher to others when he finds but little hungerings and thirstings after grace in his own soul, it is then to be feared his zeal springs rather from a selfish principle than from the Spirit of God. 2, besides this affectionate desire and readiness to preach, there must be in due season appear some competent sufficiency as to the gifts, knowledge, and utterance. Surely if the Lord sends a man to teach others, he will furnish him with the means. I believe many have intended well in setting up for preachers who went beyond or before their call in doing so. The main difference between a minister and a private Christian seems to consist in those ministerial gifts which are imparted to him, not for his own sake, but for the edification of others. But then I say these are to appear in due season. They're not to be expected instantaneously, but gradually in the use of proper means. They are necessary for the discharge of the ministry, but not necessary as prerequisites to warrant our desires after it. In your case, you are young and have time before you. Therefore, I think you need not as perplex yourself with inquiring if you have these gifts already. It is sufficient if your desire is fixed and if you're willing in the way of prayer and diligence to wait upon the Lord for them. As yet you need them not. That which finally evidences a proper call is a correspondent opening in providence by a gradual train of circumstances pointing out the means, the time, the place of actually entering upon the work. And until this coincidence arrives, you must not expect to be always clear from hesitation in your own mind. The principal causation on this head is not to be too hasty in catching at first appearances. If it be the Lord's will to bring you into his ministry, he has already appointed your place in service, and though you know it not at present, you will at a proper time. So this is on God's time frame. Now, another point. The minister is not the only person that's charged with teaching in the church. He's the one that's charged with teaching publicly from the pulpit, but that does not mean that members of the church shouldn't be able to teach as well. They should. They should be able to teach as well. Over in Hebrews chapter 5, beginning at verse 12, Paul says, For the time ye ought to be teachers, ye have need that one teach you again, which be the first principles of the oracles of God, and are become such as have need of milk and not of strong meat. You see, these people have been in the church for quite a while, but they were still babies. They hadn't grown up. They still weren't ready to teach. For everyone that useth milk is unskillful in the word of righteousness, for he's a babe. But strong meat belongeth to them that are of full age, even those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. And church members ought to be able to win people. In 1 Peter chapter 3:15, and I've referred to this verse a lot, it says, But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is within you with meekness and fear. You know, there's a reason that we have sermons on a YouTube channel. They're for you. You should know the Essential Bible Doctrine series backwards, forwards, frontwards, every way you can. You should understand the doctrine of election well enough to be able to explain it to somebody. That's the basics. Those are the building blocks. You should know that stuff. So that when what's different about your church, you could actually explain it to them and show them. Look at Colossians chapter 4. Verses 5 and 6. Walk in wisdom toward them that are without, redeeming the time. Let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer every man. After a while, you should be able to teach folks. I want you to consider Stephen. Now, Stephen, we have no record that he was ever ordained a pastor. He was a bishop, a deacon, but we have no record that he was ever a pastor. And in Acts chapter 6 and verse 10, we read, and this is after he started talking, it says, they were not able to resist the wisdom and the spirit by which he spake. These doctors of the law couldn't resist this. And then we're not going to take the time to read it this morning, but later today, read chapter 7 of Acts, and you will see Stephen's sermon to him. He could teach. Look at Acts chapter 18. Beginning at verse 24. And a certain Jew named Apollos, born at Alexandria, an eloquent man and mighty in the scriptures, came to Ephesus. This man was instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in the Spirit, he spake and taught diligently the things of the Lord, knowing only the baptism of John. And he began to speak boldly in the synagogue, whom when Aquila and Priscilla had heard, they took him unto them and expounded unto him the way of God more perfectly. They weren't ordained elders. They were members of the church, and they helped Apollos along the way. And some of the other things that you remember, the job qualifications for a pastor, we covered them earlier this morning. Well, here's one of them. Church members ought to be able to edify one another. You don't just leave that up to the pastor. You all ought to be able to do it. It says in 1 Thessalonians 5:11, wherefore comfort yourselves together and edify one another, even as also you do. You should be able to admonish and exhort one another. Romans 15:14, and I myself also am persuaded of you, my brethren, that ye also are full of goodness, filled with all knowledge, able also to admonish one another. And in Hebrews 3:13, but exhort one another daily, while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. Church members should be able to reprove and rebuke others. Ephesians 5:11, and have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. And church members should be examples to the believers. Look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 1. Beginning at verse 7. Is that right? 1 Thessalonians 1. 7. So that ye were examples to all that believe in Macedonia and Achaia, for from you sounded out the word of the Lord, not only in Macedonia and Achaia, but also in every place. Your faith to Godward is spread abroad, so that we not need to speak anything of you. And folks, women, you can do all of this, just not here. Just not standing behind this thing. If the Pope calls you and wants you to come preach at the Vatican, go with my blessing. I'll buy the plane ticket and let him have it. But you can't do it here. So in conclusion, and we've already looked at all these verses, so I'm not going to take the time to go to them again. We're running up on the clock. But I want you to consider the nature of the ministry. It's something that God gives to a qualified man to whom he also gives the ability to do the job. Now, you won't understand that until you get into the job, but he gives you the ability. And a ministry may be fulfilled before the death of the man to whom it was given. We'll look at one. Look at Numbers chapter 8. Beginning at verse 23. Numbers 8:23. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, This is it that belongeth unto the Levites. From 25 years old and upward they shall go in to wait upon the service of the tabernacle of the congregation. And from the age of 50 years they shall cease waiting upon the service thereof, and shall serve no more. Your ministry may not last your entire life. You may finish it before you get there. And we looked at a verse over in Acts earlier where it talked about them going out and preaching until they'd fulfilled the work. They finished. They were done. That can happen. Another point is that a man might be fully qualified, fully able, and still not be the one that's called. You look at the case when they needed to replace Judas Iscariot. There were two men that qualified for his office, Justus and Matthias. Two men, fully qualified. Only one was called. The other wasn't. So a man can be fully qualified to do the job and still not be called to the work. Something else, each minister has his own ministry. My ministry is to the Lakeland Church. It's not to Detroit. I don't minister in Detroit. That's Pastor Mott's ministry. That's his business. Those are his people. My people are here, and the ones that are out, the non-residents that are out west. That's my ministry. And it says over in 2 Timothy 4:5, but watch thou in all things, endure afflictions, do the work of an evangelist, make full proof of thy ministry. And another point, a man's ministry is but the instrument of God where he does his work. The work is actually coming from him. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Beginning at verse 5. Who then is Paul, and who is Apollos? But ministers by whom you believed, even as the Lord gave to every man. I have planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So neither is he that planteth anything, neither he that watereth, but God that giveth the increase. Now he that planteth and he that watereth are one, and every man shall receive his own reward according to his own labor. For we are laborers together with God. Ye are God's husbandmen. Ye are God's building. We're just the tool that's being used so that God can do what God does. And as with Moses, you might have to wait a while. Think about Moses. Moses thought when he killed the Egyptian that the people would realize that he was supposed to be the Savior. And it turns out that he had to run and wander around in the wilderness for 40 years before he was ready, before God had him humble enough to do the job he needed to do. You might have to wait a while. May not get it right away. I didn't. 25 years for me. Now, in closing, it has not been my intent by preaching this series to scare anybody away from the ministry, but simply let them see with both eyes open what they might be walking into if they ever feel the call. On one side, I'm going to be honest with you, this is a lonely life. This is a very lonely life. If you're the type of person that needs to have friends around all the time, you're going to struggle with this. You just are. Most of your time, probably 85 to 90%, you will spend by yourself. You'll have your wife and your kids to talk to, and that's about it. That's most of your life. In my case, other than Wendy, and other than on Sunday mornings here at church, I talk to the bank tellers when I make a deposit. I talk to the ladies at the dry cleaners. They know me pretty well. The cashier at Publix and my dogs. And those are most of the conversations that I have. From time to time, a non-resident member might come to town and they might come over and visit for a couple hours, but that's rare. It's usually Wendy and I are in the house by ourselves. Now, on the other side of the coin, though, as a result of a lack of human interaction, there's a connection with the Almighty that I cannot explain to you. It's as if He's sitting in the room. And that gets you through most days. We lost a minister in Canada a few years back because he just couldn't handle the solitude. He just couldn't deal with it. He had one friend in the church, and that friend, I think, died or something, and he was there by himself, which is what most of us do, and he couldn't handle it. He just couldn't handle it. And so he started going back into a lifestyle that's not conducive to being a minister. He started going to bars and throwing darts and started drinking heavily. And one Sunday afternoon after church, they discovered him on the kitchen floor passed out because he drank too much. He just couldn't handle the solitude. So if you're the type that needs people around all the time, this may not be your gig. It can be tough. However, a man with a calling who can handle the hours and weeks and months, there are a lot of rewards in this. Now, they're not what you would think. You don't put on a tuxedo and go get a little statue. None of that kind of stuff like in Hollywood. But the rewards are real. And anyone that's stood here and has seen them or has felt them in their heart understand the rewards. But they're not the type of rewards that you're going to find in the world. It's a good profession if you can handle it. But you got to understand, there's good with the bad. So in closing, to anybody that might feel they have a call or might wonder if they do, please don't hesitate to contact me. We'll talk about it and see. You never know. You know, my old baseball coach used to say, you'll never know if you can hit the ball if you don't swing the bat. So give it a shot. And with that, I thank you for your very kind and patient attention over the last couple of weeks. May the Lord add His blessing to His word. Let's stand and be dismissed in prayer.